Hi, thank you for joining us. I am Carly Putnam, Policy Director and Healthcare Policy Analyst for Oklahoma Policy Institute. With the current legislative session wrapped up, our team here at OK Policy wanted to take a few minutes to look back at that legislative session. We'll take a closer look at what lawmakers accomplished this session, what they left undone, and take a look forward at what they will need to address next year. My team of rockstar policy analysts are here with me today on budget and tax, Shinn; on criminal justice, Damion; on economic opportunity, Courtney Cullison; on education and kids issues, Rebecca Fine; policy intern Emma Morris will be talking about voting and elections, and I will finish us out on the healthcare front. We'll start first with Shinn to walk us through what happened with this year's state budget, which is one of the biggest functions of each legislative session. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Carly. It was a strange and wonderful year for the state budget. The legislature knew it would be tough going in because of the dropping oil prices going back to last fall. They had no idea that it would be tough because of a pandemic that cut their revenue by about a quarter and really cut their ability to build and negotiate a budget. What they ended up with was a pretty good patch job, is how I would characterize it. They used a lot of borrowed money, saved money, and other one-time fixes so that most agencies will only take a 4% cut. It could have been a lot worse. They were also able to do a few investments. They'll be putting money into buildings, into flood control, and into parks. What is left is there is just a need to really rethink how we do budgeting next year. First, it needs to be more out in the open, like the other 49 state legislators and Congress do it. We need to think about where we want our state to go and how then government can drive it there. The second big item in budget was cost of living adjustment for state employees. And while they do a budget every year, they only did a COLA every 12 years this time around. So retired teachers, police officers, firefighters will all have an additional 4% added to their retirement fund if they've been retired for 5 years, less than that if they've been retired less than 5 years. Again, there's lots of work to do next session on better funding retirement systems and better supporting retirement systems. Carly?
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. We'll move now to Courtney Cullison, our economic opportunity analyst. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't just create a national health crisis, it also had enormous economic implications. Courtney, what went on in your session regarding economic opportunity and financial security, and what issues will you be keeping an eye on moving forward?
It was a relatively quiet legislative session for economic opportunity. The legislature really didn't take a lot of action in this area. They didn't make things worse, but they also didn't make them better. And that's going to leave a lot of opportunity to step up and provide some much needed relief for working families next session. So first, the legislature did not enact any new barriers to access the safety net for struggling families who may need a bit of help to get by. So that means that programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as SNAP, and others will continue to operate as they have been to help Oklahoma families facing hard times. There was an attempt, unsuccessful, to reduce the number of weeks that unemployment benefits are available in Oklahoma. Currently, we offer up to 26 weeks of benefits, and there was an attempt to bump that down to just 12 weeks as long as the unemployment rate is officially below 5.5%. So given that there's usually a 6 to 8 week delay in updating the official unemployment rates for states, this bill really could have made our response to the economic crisis much less effective by timing some people out of the program despite changed economic conditions. Fortunately, though that bill passed the House in March, the Senate did not take it up, and so the attempt was not successful. The legislature didn't really take much other action, and that means that working families will not be getting a boost this year. Oklahoma has two tax credits, the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC, and the Sales Tax Relief Credit, that are targeted at low-income families and provide them with an important income boost during tax time. Unfortunately, the legislature declined to take action to increase the effectiveness of either of these credits. As you said, Carly, this COVID-19 crisis has really had a significant economic impact on the state, and we expect that to continue to be felt well into next year. And that makes the next session an important opportunity to help working families weather this crisis. Strengthening tax credits for working families and shoring up the safety net will be critically important. And the legislature should also be working toward ensuring that all Oklahoma workers have access to paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave, because this recent experience with COVID-19 has made it clear that paid leave is really more than just a fringe benefit. It's a necessity for all workers. So those are just some of the issues that we'll be looking for in the legislature next year.
Thank you, Courtney. And as you say, I think the pandemic really illustrated why so many safety net programs and benefits for workers are actually central to having a strong workforce. Justice reform measures have also been a hot topic in Oklahoma over the last many years. Joining us now will be criminal justice policy analyst Damion Shinn. Damion, what do you see as the big issues that were addressed during this session, and what do we need to be keeping an eye on for next year?
Well, thank you, Carly. The first thing I'd want to point out is that the shortened 2020 legislative session really slowed down the passage of a number of important criminal justice reform measures. We had historic fines and fees reforms, driver's license suspensions reforms that could ensure thousands of Oklahomans didn't lose their driver's licenses simply for court debt and failing to pay that debt. Sentencing reforms, as well as significant improvements in investments for mental health that were forestalled by the pandemic and by various processes that made it impossible for the legislature to act. The biggest reforms that actually did have an opportunity to make it forward were several juvenile justice reform measure that prohibits the incarceration of children under the age of 12, which we wouldn't imagine to be a profound problem, but in a state like Oklahoma, with such a high incarceration rate, even for our juvenile offenders, even children have found themselves wrapped up in our incarceral crisis. There were also investments in teleconferencing tools and video conferencing that will hopefully protect the rights of the accused as they go into trial as the COVID-19 crisis continues. Other than those reforms, we really only saw movement of several attempts to roll back recent justice reforms, like State Question 780. Fortunately, the process that slowed down the legislative session also made it impossible for these very destructive measures that would increase Oklahoma's incarceration rate to move forward. Moving forward in next year, the legislature will have to revisit bail reform. We are hopeful that they will revisit the historic fines and forms reforms and driver's license reforms that were also close to being completed this session. If they don't, it is unlikely that Oklahoma will continue the positive progress of recent years. We have the third highest per capita incarceration rate in the nation now, but only a small amount of reform in Louisiana or Mississippi could change that picture dramatically if Oklahoma lawmakers don't continue to invest in what works to reduce crime, invest in treatment for those struggling with addiction, invest in programs for those who may be experiencing homelessness, issues of mental health, and issues of trauma and the need for care. It is those investments that could really change our system and make our state better going forward for the long term.
Area more than any other was where we saw the both benefits and then issues that came with having such a shortened legislative session. A lot of really important bills didn't move, but a lot of really destructive ones stayed put. We'll move now to education, which is always a hot topic in the legislative space. Joining us now will be our education analyst, Rebecca Fine, to talk about major developments for education this spring. Welcome, Rebecca. What happened this year regarding education, and what do lawmakers need to keep in mind for the coming year?
Thanks, Carly. So Common Education, fortunately, was spared deeper budget cuts than other agencies face due to the downturn from the coronavirus. The FY21 education budget was cut 2.5%, but fortunately, federal stimulus funding will largely offset these cuts for most districts. And despite the short legislative session, there were a few significant pieces of legislation that made its way to the governor's desk. Two bills brought greater oversight and funding equity to virtual charter schools. The first bill is House Bill 2905, or the Virtual Charter School Reform and Transparency Act of 2020. And this bill puts in place rules that will bring greater oversight and transparency for statewide virtual charter schools. So these include new rules governing student enrollment and transfer between brick and mortar schools and virtual charter schools, and also more rigorous standards for what constitutes instructional activities, along with a requirement that students complete a virtual charter school student orientation prior to beginning classwork. So these are all great reforms. Additionally, another bill adjusted the funding of virtual charter schools to more accurately reflect the weighted average daily attendance and bring it more in line with how brick and mortar schools are funded. There's another bill related to charter schools. It reduced the maximum administrative fee that sponsoring districts can charge charter schools from 5% to 3%. And it also sets up a fund that would pay for any costs related to a charter school closure to help absorb this fee reduction. As Paul also mentioned earlier, perhaps one of the most substantial and important bills that was passed relating to retired teachers was their first COLA in over a decade. So teachers will receive a 2% increase in benefits if they have been retired between 2 and 5 years, and a 4% increase for those who have been retired over 5 years. This is a really great win. Unfortunately, there was a bill, Senate Bill 362, that would have made some important modifications and to the state aid funding formula that didn't pass. And this would have included increasing the weight for economically disadvantaged students. Hopefully next session we'll see some legislators who propose a similar bill. And low-income students require additional funding to meet their needs generally, and especially now, as these students, are all students, and especially low-income students, are going to have to play catch-up due to the coronavirus. They need to provide additional funding, and a bill that would increase the weight that low-income students, funding that low-income students receive, would be even more important next session.
Thank you, Rebecca. We've talked a lot about how the COVID-19 and moving to distance learning has really brought to bear significant equity issues when it comes to education access, and 362 or a similar measure going forward to try to make sure that students are getting the support they need is going to be quite important going into the coming year. Next up, we have Emma Morris, who has been serving as our policy intern for the spring and summer. One of the projects this session included looking at voting and how Oklahomans can cast their ballots safely and securely. This hot button issue kind of all of a sudden this spring when the Oklahoma Supreme Court struck down the notary requirement for absentee voting. Emma, can you give us the rundown with what happened this session regarding our election laws and some that lawmakers can keep in mind for next year to allow Oklahomans to vote safely?
Yeah, so like Carly said, this became an issue in the last few weeks of session. All Oklahomans should be able to easily and safely vote from their home, but actions on the part of the legislature have made that more difficult than it needs to be. The recent state Supreme Court ruling removed the requirement that absentee ballots be notarized and would allow a signed personal statement to suffice instead. And this would have allowed Oklahomans to vote safely without having to leave their home to find a notary. But unfortunately, the legislature effectively nullified this ruling when they passed Senate Bill 210 and codified the notary requirement. They did carve out an exception during times of emergencies, which would allow absentee voters to include a copy of identification with their ballot instead of getting it notarized. But with either one of these requirements, Oklahoma is one of only 3 states with the strictest absentee voter laws. And there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud in other states that use more accessible methods for absentee voting, such as signature verification or relying on witness signatures. Most recently, on May 20th, the Oklahoma Democratic Party and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee sued the state election board in federal court in hopes of overturning these policies. But no matter the outcome of this case, next year it will be vital that the legislature work towards implementing an absentee voting system that doesn't place unnecessary barriers between voters and their ballots. And they can do this by first overturning Senate Bill 210 and instead instituting a different way of validating ballots, one that is used by the majority of other states, and that would be signature verification.
Thank you, Emma, for that overview, and thank you also for becoming an expert on Oklahoma voting and elections very quickly this spring. We're really glad to have you on board. And speaking of Oklahoma making things more complicated than it has to, for us to conclude, I'll put on my health policy analyst hat and share some thoughts about what's been happening with healthcare policy issues in the state of Oklahoma, specifically concerning Medicaid expansion. In the last few weeks on the healthcare policy front, the dust has settled to reveal a really complicated and unclear situation as Oklahoma contemplates how to expand Medicaid. And as a reminder, if Oklahoma expands Medicaid, hundreds of thousands of poor, uninsured, working age adults would be able to get the health care that they need. 37 states have expanded Medicaid so far. Oklahoma is one of the remaining holdouts. The federal government would spend $9 on Medicaid expansion for every dollar that the state would spend, with about $1 billion in federal money coming into the state annually with Medicaid expansion. This spring, Oklahoma essentially had 2 Medicaid expansion options. State Question 802, which would authorize full Medicaid expansion in Oklahoma if passed by voters, and Sooner Care 2.0, Governor Stitt's alternative to that state question. To the surprise of, I think, pretty much everybody, Governor Stitt vetoed the funding mechanism for Sooner Care 2.0 in the last active days of legislative session. That bill would have funded the first stage of Sooner Care 2.0. Governor Stitt then told federal regulators that, contrary to his earlier promises, Oklahoma would not be expanding Medicaid in July of this year. With that veto, we would expect that the second stage of Sooner Care 2.0, which called for the addition of work requirements and a dangerous new funding scheme, would also not move forward. However, the state has not withdrawn its proposal to the federal government for that second stage. And in fact, that proposal is up for public comment right now through June 27th. And you can learn more about that and leave a public comment on this proposal at coverok.org. With all of this, it's not at all clear what Governor Stitt's plan for Sooner Care 2.0 is right now, and the governor's office has been noticeably silent on that point. At the same time, Oklahomans are set to vote on a different Medicaid expansion plan, State Question 802, on June 30th. If passed by voters, State Question 802 would require the state to implement full, complete Medicaid expansion, full stop, and protect it by putting it in the Constitution. Taken together, this creates a really confusing situation. By all accounts, Sooner Care 2.0 should not be able to proceed, given that Governor Stitt effectively killed its first stage. His expansion plan should not be able to move forward without that first stage. If State Question 802 passes, his expansion plan should still be unable to move forward. The expansion described in State Question 802 is incompatible with the one in Governor Stitt's plan. The only thing that's really clear right now is that Governor Stitt's actions have made what was already a very complicated situation even more complicated, which I didn't know was possible. And this kind of confusion has actual consequences. Oklahomans need health care. Oklahoma is in the midst of a global health crisis, and Oklahoma's uninsured rate is the second highest in the US. And specifically, Oklahomans need Medicaid. Medicaid expansion will increase access to public health insurance for low-income adults, and a truly staggering share of Oklahomans have lost their jobs and their health insurance in the last few months. That's exactly the situation that Medicaid expansion is for. When he vetoed his Sooner Care 2.0 bill, Governor Stitt said in part that Oklahoma couldn't afford Medicaid expansion now because too many people would need it. That couldn't be further from the truth, as the experiences of every other state that has expanded so far shows. We can't afford not to expand. Oklahomans need Medicaid expansion. And that wraps up our overview of this year's legislative session. I'd like to thank the members of the policy team for joining in this discussion and our communications team for facilitating it. As always, we will continue to monitor developments coming from lawmakers and administrators statewide. We encourage you to stay engaged in our work by following us on social media. You can also subscribe to our emails or advocacy alerts through our website at okpolicy.org. Thank you for watching.